agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined, as usual, by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hey, it's great to be back, Trey.
It's always fun doing the show with you, and this time, we get this week, and then just so listeners are prepared, it's kind of like we're taking over. We've got this week, we're doing the bonus show this week as we continue talking about the Constitution. I'm really excited about that, but you're going to get us back to back, right? So next week is also you and me, Ken, and next week's bonus show is you and me, Ken. So it's going to be a lot of it, the two of us for the Politics Guys for the next couple of weeks. Are you as excited as I am?
Yeah, we're taking over.
Well, I mean, we are in polling. We are often the clear winners of the most popular politics guys. It's an empirical truth. As a scientist, I have to trust the data. Now, as true as that may or may not be, though, what we will be taking on, and this is definitely true because we've laid it out, we're going to be talking about the shortest prime minister in UK's history. We're going to be leading with that story. We're going to talk about Putin declaring martial law in the annexed regions of the Ukraine. We're going to be talking about the what had happened in a bunch of the debates here this past week, Ohio, Georgia, Arizona. We're also going to make some predictions for the midterm elections and see where things might be headed. If we have time, we're going to be talking about Lindsey Graham being required to testify in 2020 and potentially also as well Iran supporting Russia in its fight against Ukraine and maybe even a few other things from there. But we'll see what we can get to, but we're going to definitely get to those first four stories. But before we do that, we're going to take just a brief pause and we'll be there. Well, Ken, this is really a bizarre year for the United Kingdom. First, we have the tragic incidents, maybe not the unforeseen, of the death of Queen Elizabeth, but now in a bit of political drama, Thursday, current Prime Minister Liz Truss, after only 44 days, that's 6 weeks, has signaled her resignation as leader of the Conservative Party and therefore as Prime Minister, giving her the dubious distinction of being the shortest serving Prime Minister in all of British history. Now, most think this is the result of her retreat from her tax cut plans after the financial markets plummeted in response to them. In her words, quote, "I recognize that given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party," she said, standing outside Downing Street. Now, meanwhile, conservatives in polls are, not surprisingly, way down. Now, for all of the Americans listening to this show or people in other countries, just a little bit of heads up. What this means, because she's resigning, she's not going to be prime minister, but that means that the British Conservative Party has to quickly find a new leader. And as a result of that, a new prime minister. And crazily enough, they've got to get this done by Friday of next week. So there are several possibilities, but you'll see what you need as a result of the rules in Parliament. The House has to come up with at least 100 votes from members of Parliament to be a contender. And right now, there's not a lot of individuals that seem to be getting to that spot. Now, there are some possibilities, but weirdly, and this is where the drama continues, Ken, one of those is actually former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The two highest pollers as of today, Friday, are Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. It takes 100 votes to be a contender. Now, what's weird is Sunak, he was actually part of the movement to out Boris and was against the economic plans of Truss, and that has alienated the Johnson wing of the party. But likewise, though, kind of like Trump and his scandal-ridden presidency, Johnson is a scandal-ridden prime minister who has angered a lot of members of his own Conservative Party. So what could, or I think many conservatives hoped, would end up being a relatively quick process. Well, you don't want to have this process at all, of course, after 44 days. Looks like it's going to probably be difficult and weirdly includes the former outed prime minister. This is like drama layer on drama layer. So, Ken, thoughts?
Yeah, I have a couple different kinds of thoughts about this. I've been following this story very closely. One aspect of it that seems to me to be probably much more significant than what I've been reading in the coverage. The coverage is kind of focusing on what's happened in the last few weeks, but I do see Brexit as the major factor in all this, and that happened a little while ago. But Brexit really began the period of chronic political instability in Great Britain. We've now had there've been 5 Tory prime ministers in the last 7 years, which is not so. Not only is she the most short-lived prime minister in British history, but Liz Truss. But we've got this period of instability, and I think it happens because without being part of the European Union, Britain is basically shackled to the judgment of bond markets. And it was really, the bond markets that just said, well, Truss is unacceptable. And then she had to go. And Britain sort of put itself in this extremely unsustainable situation where, they've damaged their ability through Brexit to have trade with their closest trading partners. So that's inflicted damage on their economy, which is ongoing. They have much greater economic vulnerability to the markets. They're facing the very real prospect of the dissolution of the United Kingdom if Scotland leaves. And all of this are sort of the direct consequences of Brexit that have just left England in a kind of state of panic-inducing decline that I think has caused all this political instability. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there, that I think you have to look at that when you think about why is this happening. But then, on the other part of what you said, Johnson is probably on his way back in. I think he can, credibly present himself similar to what Trump could possibly do here, as sort of the only person who can hold together all the diverse groups that make up the coalition that make up his party. And so, he was ousted because of scandals, and also, I think, because of the disintegrating situation that Brexit had caused. And Johnson was probably the prime mover behind Brexit more than any other single person. But he does seem to have support from more wings of the party. And the last piece of that I'll just mention is, Liz Truss, I think, comes from the more libertarian wing of the British Conservative Party. And if you sort of think about those grids you sometimes see where you've got, fiscal and social, and then you've got liberal and conservative, and we usually say, well, the libertarians are the fiscal conservatives and the social liberals. And, and then you also have like the Trumpers who are the religious right, who are the social conservatives and the fiscal liberals. And then you have your more traditional liberals and conservatives, fiscal on both or I'm sorry, conservative on both or liberal on both. I think that libertarian square, which I know is the square that you've oftentimes put yourself in, Trey, I feel like this is just more evidence that that's the square that has the smallest constituency. And when she moved forward plans that were sort of based on that kind of agenda, implementing a fairly severe for Britain fiscal conservatism combined with essential social liberalism, suddenly there's no constituency for that, and she couldn't hang on, and it was just that much worse because it was in the midst of all these problems that Brexit has caused and that nobody can solve.
I mean, I wish I could disagree with part of that, but no, I don't think you're wrong. I think the libertarian wing is at a wane around the world right now, in part because I think the ideals of liberalism writ large, which, right, classical or libertarianism is one variant, is currently on the wane, right? I don't think that those are particularly popular positions. And I think in the past, where you had a more easy alliance between some more classical or traditional conservatives and libertarians worked out because of their overlap on fiscal policy, but I don't see that as being the case. So I don't think you're entirely wrong there. But I agree, but I might kind of take your argument further to make maybe an ideological case to say the fact that Brexit is causing so much instability, I think is an example of the value of both liberalism writ large, ideologically, and the importance of the economic ties that bind countries together, i.e., kind of the libertarian argument when it comes to international relations as it creates stability inside of countries. So I actually agree with your analysis, but I would take it a step further and say that this is in fact a defense of liberalism, right? So if the kind of nationalist populist position was correct, then we should see additional stability and positive outcomes as we retreat and sever economic ties. But we don't see that. Instead, we see what we're seeing right now, which is a historic period of British instability. And I mean, you were, I think, kind of assuming this. I mean, we all know this, but something I think we're saying, the United Kingdom, if anything, is known for its moderation and long-term stability, even compared to places like the United States. But as you rightfully point out, that has not been the case recently. But again, I would make an ideological argument that that's because of this larger rejection of liberalism. I'm curious what you think about that kind of extension of your take.
Yeah, I agree with it. I think, I tended to think of the European Union project as a political project first and an economic project second. And it sounds to me like, perhaps you're thinking it more of an economic project first and a political project second.
Think historically even, right? I mean, the EU emerges out of economic agreements, originally a coal agreement that then extends to a variety of other economic connections. And so, yeah, I think the reason you end up with the political connections you do in the EU, and for this I actually turned to one of my colleagues, Dr. Dan Doty, who kind of this was his dissertation, his argument, and I thought, again, he's not a libertarian by any means, but I agreed with him, was without those underpinnings of the early economic ties, you wouldn't have had the ability to have the political will for political ties. So I do see it leading in that direction, even just historically as you look at it.
Well, yeah. So my read on that is the European Coal and Steel Union was the first beginnings of what later became the European Union. But I don't think that was entered into primarily for reasons of, helping the coal and steel industries have more free trade. I think it was really about making sure that no single country could control those war-making industries. So it's a political project that the idea is that the war-making industries, which were the coal and steel industries, there was this idea that if countries could dominate those industries, then countries could have the material ability to make war on other European countries. And so the idea of putting those under common governance and having the trade barriers taken down was to make sure that every country had its share of coal and steel, and every country, and then you have the mutual deterrence effect, and then you have the stronger political union. But in any case, I don't really think we disagree. These are just disagreements in emphasis, because ultimately the European Union project, whether you think it was primarily an economic project or primarily a political project, it was clearly both. And severing it is it's immediately severing economic ties more. And by making trade harder and more expensive, it's hurting the economies of every country in Europe. And as we see here right now, where the economy is a source of some political instability here, the economic troubles that the UK is going through, which are, they're facing all the same challenges we're facing, but they're also facing these self-inflicted challenges of having cut them off from trade they cut themselves off from trade that most of their major industries had been engaged in, and just like shot their own economy in the foot that way. That's obviously, causing these convulsions in political life there.
Well, and to extend that, you're right. It also extends to the possibility of what happens with the United Kingdom itself when you now have these weirder, harder political borders in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I don't see that. I don't see that the situation there is sustainable, and I don't think anyone in the island of Ireland wants to, have a war in terms of a hot war with fighting. Right. But the situation is, I think it's getting increasingly unsustainable for Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, and I think there will be, trade wars on that island unless Northern Ireland exits. And I think we're kind of at an inflection point now where because there always have been and still are more Protestants in Northern Ireland than Catholics in Northern Ireland. The majorities in Northern Ireland have tended to identify more with the United Kingdom than with the Republic of Ireland, and not wanted to leave. But I think that's actually starting to change, where the religious affiliation for some Northern Irelanders is not enough of a reason anymore to want to stay in the UK. And that of course Scotland, which is also like the UK, mainly Protestant, they're actually further down the road to wanting to leave the UK, I think, than Northern Ireland is. So the sort of convulsions that are caused by Brexit are extremely destabilizing to UK federalism as well. It sort of leaves most of the areas that aren't England really wondering why they're still in the UK instead of in the EU.
Yeah. Now, and to be clear, we've talked about this. That word federalism there is not going to apply quite the same way as you might think in the United States. But that's as an aside. But kind of the long-term outlook here, right? I mean, one possibility is the United Kingdom recently moved from having calling elections with a maximum of 5 years to having a fixed election cycle that could, under unusual circumstances, be called more early. And this plays out about the same time you have the movement to want to begin in Brexit, at least its implementation. So do you think that the Tories, do you think the Conservative Party holds out for the 5-year tenure, given that they're down in the polls? Or do you think that if we have an inability to kind of coalesce around a prime minister, there ends up being an election?
Yeah, it's hard to predict where that's headed. I mean, I think you explained it just right again, but the Tories have very strong incentives not to hold an early election because they will lose an early election. Their approval rating is down to 14% right now, and they have the right to hang on until 2025 without having an election. And if they have an election, they'll probably lose their majority. So I think they have strong incentives not to have an election. But on the other hand, they do have these internal factional disputes and schisms, which you talked about earlier, and it is kind of playing out, with Sunak and maybe Johnson appearing as the front runners. And there's one or two other names that have been batted around for possible new prime minister. But if none of them can secure a majority within the Tories, then they won't be able to appoint a prime minister. And that would be one of those rare situations where they might have to have an early election, because there is going to have be a vote of the parliament. And in the vote of the parliament, if there's no majority to appoint a prime minister, if no coalition can be formed, then there has to be an early election. So it really depends if the Tories can settle their internal differences or not. And at this juncture, even though we're only a week away, I don't have a prediction about that.
No, it's a difficult one to do, and yeah, I mean, I think that probably I think it's a little better than a coin toss that they end up, some minor faction ends up settling and they select a particular new PM, but I put it at just slightly better than a coin toss.
Yeah, remember though that if only, I think it would only take about 15 or 20% of the Tories to if 15 or 20% of the Tory members of Parliament didn't accept that deal, they could vote on the same side as the other parties
And
not to accept the new prime minister, and then that would defeat the much larger majority of their own party.
No, it's true, and that again, that's why I say I mean I would put it barely better than a coin flip. I'm with you.
Yeah.
No, because there's not a lot of margin for error there, but simultaneously, and this is an example of where we just have to kind of admit our ignorance. Maybe if I was better able to count what those votes would look like in the way that we might do in the Senate or the House, I might have a better prediction mechanism. But I'm not even sure there's anybody who studies British politics who could probably give you a much better answer. But I want to be cautious on that because, again, I don't know all of those individual MPs enough to really give you an answer. But that's another thing that makes it hard, right? Because in British politics, the individual MPs don't have a lot of independence. So it's not as if you're kind of studying them all the time, because generally you're just talking about party line votes. That's what happens in parliamentary systems, because otherwise you have government failing if you can't pass your laws. So it's very different than the American system, where individual members of Congress have a ton of independence, and therefore we look and think about how they might vote or behave in that body all the time. So it's also unusual on that front, because you have to kind of figure out, well, how would these individual MPs vote? And that's not normally something you would do analyzing the system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking. The New York Times did have an article where they listed a bunch of the names of possible contenders and summarized who they were. And it looks to me, and these are, as you're saying, these are people I was not personally very familiar with, but a couple, with clearly Johnson and Sunak being the front runners, the sort of dark horses who are still in the race. One would be Penny Mordaunt, who was she's a 50-year-old woman. She was briefly the leader of the Tories in the House of Commons. She does serve in the Royal Navy Reserve, and she was even British Defense Secretary for 2.5 months in 2019. And she seems to be, one of the contenders. Another one who also comes from a defense background is the current Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, who was a career military person until he entered politics. And he, has been a supporter of Truss, which may taint him a little bit now if he's associated with her policies. And he was a big opponent of Brexit. The other one is Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary, and she's a bit younger. She's only about 40, but she has been kind of a leading advocate of Britain's anti-immigrant movement, and so she has certainly some support from that base. So those, I think, are other people who are in it. But like you, I think I probably would think the question about those candidates is, who are they going to be willing to form a coalition with? Is it going to be with Sunak or is it going to be with Johnson? Because I just think those are the two that have a really bona fide chance.
No, I agree. Well, why don't we continue to keep our focus a little weirdly overseas for just a moment, and then turn the second half of the show over to our more traditional American issues and talk about a development in the Russian conflict with Ukraine. Now, I'm going to take just 2 seconds here to mention something, because this comes up on social media a lot. I know that I have a habit of referring to Ukraine as the Ukraine, right? and that is nothing more than a habit on my part. It is not a political commentary on my part. I mean, if I was, I wouldn't care. I'd be honest about it. But I have no secret Russian position, and I don't mean anything ideological about that. So as we're talking about this, if I happen to slip up, I'm going to work hard, and I have been, but obviously I have not gotten that perfectly. If I say the Ukraine as opposed to the Ukraine, see right there, I was even as I'm thinking about it, I don't mean anything political by that. Just to be clear on that front, and to try to clear up any confusion. My apologies that I recognize that can seem that way, but try growing up in the 80s and then just getting that out of your head, right? That's really what that is. So anyway, be that as it is. This Wednesday, Ken, Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would be imposing martial law in the 4 regions in Ukraine that he had seized. Now, this comes in the wake of huge setbacks in these regions for the Russian military. As a matter of fact, the last time we talked, I had even brought up, I thought that they were going to enter into these territories rather quickly, and sure enough, they did. So it's not as if the Russian military controls all of these territories anymore. As a matter of fact, on Wednesday, Putin signed some wartime measures for the regions bordering Ukraine, which includes Crimea. Now, simultaneously, and this is something that we saw on Thursday, was that the White House has claimed it has evidence that Iranian troops are, quote, directly engaged on the ground, end quote, in Crimea, and being used to help Russian drone attacks on Ukraine. The British has said that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard members are assisting Russian forces specifically with the use of drones. And we've seen this week that the Russians have been using drones to target civilian infrastructure. Biden, as a result, and the White House is looking at new sanctions for Iran. Now, Iran, this kind of continues. Iran has been has had a significant amount of unrest in the wake of the death of 22-year-old Masha Amini, who died in Iranian custody for not covering her head with a hijab, which is required by law in Iran. Now, the Biden administration basically says there's not much left to discuss or to negotiate. In the words of the White House, quote, we're not focused on diplomacy at this point. What we are focused on is making sure that we're holding the regime accountable, end quote. So, Ken, what do you think about the most recent escalation from Putin, both in terms of military distance strategy, which seems to be a little bit desperate, simultaneously with martial law in areas that he doesn't control, and now this relationship between Russia and Iran in kind of almost an advisor capacity?
Yeah, advising and even training, apparently, too.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm going to go ahead and point a finger of blame at the Republicans in Congress in the United States for both of these developments, because, first of all, I don't think Iran would have had as much reason to want to come in on and help the Russians here if we had better relationships with Iran than we have. And we were working towards that under the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama negotiated and implemented. And then, Trump came in and tore that up, and the Republicans in Congress made it very, very difficult for Biden to normalize relations with Iran when he came back. So it doesn't surprise me that, Iran, which is already under tremendous amount of sanctions from us, doesn't see a lot to lose by risking coming even under a few more sanctions from us, and maybe sees a lot to gain from strengthening American enemies now. We're really the ones more than them who pulled back from the process of trying to normalize relations, which was underway a decade ago. And then also with Putin here, I mean, McCarthy's been going around saying on the campaign trail that if the Republicans get control of the Congress, then first thing in January, we're not going to be helping Ukraine as much as we have been. So I think, with those kind of incentives, Putin's losing on the battlefield, but he's thinking, well, if I double down, I really only have like 4 or 5 months where I have to keep, well, now only 3 months where I just have to keep hanging in there. And then the cavalry will come. The Republican Congress will make sure that the United States stops supporting Ukraine. And then when that happens, everything's going to get much easier for Russia. So to me, these are, reflections of American political developments and their impacts in Tehran and in Moscow.
I agree in half. So I do think that it's irresponsible for McCarthy to be running around and effectively saying, look, we should turn a blind eye to what's happening with Russia. And that undoubtedly is going to be part of what anybody is making that connection for. Now, between Russia and Iran, though, one of the things that I struggle with, right? We were talking about this in terms of the United Kingdom with the rest of the European Union, but I do actually have sympathy. One of the problems that I've had with democratic foreign policy is that they don't have a consistent idea for, okay, when do we negotiate with bad guys and when do we not? And I understood some of the objections with Iran and the increasing of the normalized relations with them, since it was clear and apparent that they were attempting to go around those. Now, I probably wouldn't have torn it up in the way that Trump did. As a matter of fact, the two of us had talked about this on the show. But nevertheless, this idea that we're going to be able to have normalized relations, it is fascinating how which parties think at which times we're going to be able to have normalized relations with which particular authoritarian, repressive governments, and then either side blaming the other for picking the wrong authoritarians to hang out with. Yeah, of course, Iran is going to be closer to Russia as a result of the fact that it doesn't want to be part of sanctions. But I'm not sure if that's a really great answer for dealing with the Iranian with a repressive government. What would you say to? I'm curious what your response to that is. Because again, I agree with you on the Republican with McCarthy spot, but the other side of.
So I think your overall critique is fair, and I don't quibble with it, but I think as applied to the specifics of Iran, I think that there was an opening there at this point in time. There was movement, in good directions in terms of Iran. We're seeing that the Iranian population is more open to wanting to change the form of government that they have, wanting to be more involved with the West. You described some incidents this week where of course there were clashes between the government and the citizenry, but that related to the idea that the citizenry was seeking more of an opening. And I think with encouragement, it seemed like a good time for strategic intervention. And also, I think the way that Obama, when he was still president, was managing that deal, there was a lot of monitoring for compliance, and there were consequences for non-compliance. But then when Trump came in, instead of saying, well, here's our expectations of what we want from Iran, and we will work towards normalization as long as they're meeting our benchmarks, he just said it doesn't matter to us whether they meet our benchmarks or not. We're going to take all the sanctions against them we possibly can. And that kind of approach just sort of blows, any influence that we could have had on how things develop in Iran going forward.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree, especially with the specifics of how the Trump administration handled its inheritance from the Obama administration, right? Especially given that the Trump administration was more than willing to have farcical talks with North Korea, for example. So in one case we're gonna deal with a repressive regime, in another case we're not going to deal with a repressive regime. So no, I don't think there's much space to argue that the Trump administration had the correct answer. Again, to go back to I think the more at least thoughtful position of the Obama administration, I recognize the idea of we want to attempt to have soft versions of influence to meet certain benchmarks. But again, I often am dubious of those, primarily because it doesn't appear to me that there's really ways of determining if those benchmarks are met. But that's a different question, of course, than whether or not the Trump response to it was appropriate. And I recognize that that's a distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I would just before we leave the topic, if you look back to an analogy from 20 years ago. When we had the Iraq War, then Saddam Hussein was a bad dictator in Iraq, but also the UN had put him under sanctions to not allow him to develop weapons of mass destruction, and there was monitoring going on, and in fact he wasn't developing weapons of mass destruction. He was in compliance with the demands that the UN had put on him, including all the demands for inspections and things like that. And just for really domestic political reasons, George W. Bush decided he wanted to be a war president. He wanted to reshape the Middle East, and he tore up those kind of agreements and started a war. And part of that was I think echoed in what happened now, that there may be domestic political reasons that some American presidents want to be seen as kind of bellicose tough guys. And they want to find some boogeyman that they can beat up on, whether it's Saddam Hussein or whether it's the Ayatollah in Iran. But it's very counterproductive, to do that if you've got ways that, through soft power, you can actually be pushing them in a good direction. And through these exercises of vilification, you just throw them, that their only option is to throw their lot in with our other enemies. And so I do think that's, what we're seeing in Crimea and Russia today. With Iranians there does have, it has historical antecedents.
I guess my last thought there on that kind of broader question is that just simply empirically, I don't think that soft power moves with authoritarian regimes specifically have as much success as we often think they do, just kind of intuitively. And as a result, and that's, I think, a difficult position because in general, I think deepening connections between countries is a positive thing, but that only seemingly works empirically on the ground when you have countries that have some degree of liberty, some degree of openness, some degree of popular connection. It doesn't appear to me, again, just historically, when you look at the data, that those soft power tools do as much as oftentimes, and this is a critique of Democrats, I think Democrats overestimate the amount of influence soft power has specifically to authoritarian regimes, dictatorial regimes, than what we actually see in the social sciences. Not to say that I want to start a war with everybody's an authoritarian regime, but just being honest about the fact that that doesn't often end up moving or changing policy in many ways in that particular circumstance. That'd be my only slight pushback, I suppose.
Yeah, except I think that is exactly why I gave the example of Saddam Hussein. Right. I mean, it was having impact on him. He was not developing weapons of mass destruction. Maybe he wanted some of his regional neighbors to think that he was, and so he was having some mixed messaging there. But it was always found by the UN inspectors that he wasn't. He was complying. And then after the U.S. Army invaded, and because I guess we supposedly didn't believe the UN inspectors, the U.S. Army found the exact same conclusions that the UN inspectors had been finding, so that there was no program to develop weapons of mass destruction. So I think that was just an example where the international sanctions regime was actually working. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And I would venture the hypothesis, although we can't test it, that if we were still in our nuclear deal with Iran right now, and if we had lifted some trade sanctions on them, that then they were at risk of having reimposed on them. And if we were moving slowly towards normalization of relations with them, and they were able to start selling us oil and things like that, they would have had a lot more to think about before they decided to start training some of Putin's military for this war in the Ukraine. They would have had a lot more to lose.
Well, as a counterpoint, I mean, we do have highly normalized relations with Saudi Arabia, for example. And despite those normalized relations, the Saudis have helped and worked with Russians and gone specifically against Biden requests for oil increases and changes. So, I mean, I hear, and I mean, obviously neither one of us can get at the counter point, but we do have a separate case that we could look at, Saudi Arabia, where we do have much more normalized relations, but not really any additional controls, soft power effects, or them not being willing to side against the United States. So would you take that as being a potential counterexample, even though since we can't look at the counterexample of what might have happened with Iran?
Well, I think the difference there, and I certainly agree that it's a good counterexample, but I think the difference is Saudi Arabia, for better or worse, has been able to have extremely normal relations with one American political party, and it sees itself as a player inside American politics. So when Saudi Arabia supports policies that I might see as anti-American, like deciding to cut oil production and raise prices right now to put the squeeze on America at this particular time, I think they perceive that as being pro-American because it's actually helping the Republicans, and it may influence the midterm elections, which we're going to get to a little later in the show. The price of energy going up is having an influence on these elections, and I think the Saudis are extremely aligned with the Republican Party in America, and sometimes hurting America helps the Republican Party. And I think the Saudis, that's where they are. So I think that's an unusual case. Whereas if you're looking at other kinds of authoritarian dictatorships, I don't think they get as involved in the partisan politics in the United States as what the Saudis are doing.
I guess my last critique, and then we really have to move on because we're going to go long in these first two segments, is just that I think that authoritarian regimes, because of the nature of what they're doing, are always going to attempt to play those kinds of party debates. I mean, as a matter of fact, that's inherent in the ideological critiques between democracy and authoritarianism, right? So authoritarians basically argue that democratic institutions are unstable, and therefore the way that you attack democratic institutions is you pick sides, or you attempt to always fight for the party that's out of power so that you have certain kinds of instabilities. I mean that goes all the way back to just political theorists between. I know it's weird. On this show, this might be something but there are actually pro-authoritarian political theorists, right? And anti-democratic. I'm thinking, for example, of the classic "The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy." Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on who writes that book though. Can you?
Yeah, I don't know. I believe it. I don't know. I can't name the person whose theory it is. Yeah, I actually agree with you. Saudi Arabia is not the only country like that, of course, because Russia's like that too. Russia's another country that's intervening, on behalf of the Republicans in American politics. But I just don't think. I don't think it has anything to do with them being Republicans.
I think it has to do with the ideological idea that you try to blow up elections in any particular country when you're an authoritarian regime. The weakness of a democracy is its elections, according to authoritarianism.
Yeah. Right. I do agree with that, but I just don't think that's how all of these countries operated. So I don't really think that's what Iran was ever doing. I don't think that's what Saddam Hussein's Iraq was ever doing. I think they maybe just didn't have the strength or the sophistication or even the concern to try to destroy America through its electoral system. But yeah, I think that's what the Saudis are doing, although they probably don't think of it as destroying America. They probably think of it as strengthening America by helping their friends, the Republicans. I think in the Russian case, they do think of their interference as destroying America, and they think of Trump as the greatest agent of chaos to destroy America that they ever were lucky enough to stumble across. But I think smaller totalitarian countries and smaller and less sophisticated totalitarian countries are less likely to really be having sophisticated programs to interfere with American elections. And I think, I would put Iran and Iraq in those kind of buckets. And I don't see any evidence that they ever tried anything like that.
Well, I'm gonna cut us both short there, and we're gonna take a brief pause, and we'll be back in just a moment. Okay, so Ken, we have spent half of a show chatting about foreign policy, other countries. It's about time we headed back to the United States, got national with it or something, I don't know, and took on some of the things happening this week in the United States. There's a lot of things, and one of those big items is we've had a bunch of debates around the country at big levels and small levels. Even here in Oklahoma City, we had our one and only debate between Kevin Stitt and Joy Hoffmeister, which is shaping up to be an absolutely interesting case to see what's going on here for the governor of Oklahoma. But let's look a little bit bigger than some of those, because we have a lot of debates around the country, including in your backyard, Ken, in Ohio, but also in Georgia and Arizona. And so I thought we might look around the country at these debates, see what we thought about some of those, and then check in as kind of a related story into some of our predictions for November, since we're closing in on about 3 weeks until elections. So right now, so for example, taking a look at what we got going on right now, we see this past week that in both debates, like for example, Walker, man, he's getting a lot of credit for the debate, and he seems to be getting a bump in the poll for that in Georgia. And that seems to be a possibility across the board, is that Republicans did a lot better debating, I think, than they were going to give me or anybody else was going to give them credit for doing. And we're seeing some of those poll bumps. That might not be true in Ohio, though. That was a little bit different. So what do you think about the Walker debate? What do you think about the J.D. Vance debate in Ohio and Georgia? Let's start there.
Yeah, well, first let me start by admitting, although I watched both of the two debates between Ryan and Vance here in Ohio, And in fact, I watched a couple of debates between Shabbat and Landsman, who are the contenders for the House seat in Cincinnati, which is one of the country's closest races right now. I didn't actually watch the debates from other states. I did read news coverage of them. I know all about Herschel Walker's stunt of trying to pull out a badge and that kind of thing.
Well, that actually happened before the debate. That happened before the debate.
Oh, that happened before. Yeah. I thought that happened during the debate, that he pulled out a badge during a debate.
Did he do that too? He had actually, that claim came out before the debate. But yeah, no, because well, we can talk more. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, I thought he got disciplined by the moderator because he broke the rule against using props during the debate. But the bottom line in terms of the polls impact, of course, you're right. I mean, the polls have been tightening. That's been happening, concurrently with when all these debates have been happening. So you can't, rule out the idea that the debates are helping the Republicans, and I think you can rule out the idea that the debates are helping the Democrats, because the polls keep moving in Republican directions right now. There may be other factors that are bigger factors in that. The Democratic candidates, by and large, had been outraising and outspending the Republicans through most of this year. But then these huge amounts of dark money are starting to come in now on the Republican side. So even though I think Democrats are continuing to outraise Republicans, in these final 3 weeks, the Republicans are starting to very heavily outspend Democrats, or at least spending on Republicans is heavily outspending spending on Democrats. So that, I think you can't separate that when you think about, well, why are the polls moving this direction? And also at the same time, of course, as we just talked about, the Saudis have decided to do their best to keep gas prices high here. And Biden has, continued the support for Ukraine, which has had a similar impact on natural gas prices here. So I think a lot of Americans are, worried about inflation, worried about the economy, and so the longer the things go on, the more people get concerned. So the debates are one factor among others, but I made some pretty bold predictions a few months ago, as you know, that the Democrats were going to have a cakewalk, and I will have to eat my words now because there's no cakewalks here. But the debates, I guess the one other thing, I'll address the Ohio one more than the others, because I did watch. There were two debates between Vance and Ryan. Neither of them were televised here in Cincinnati. They both took place in Northern Ohio, and they both took place on local TV stations with right-wing ownership. And that was the only reason that Vance was willing, or that's the only platform that Vance was willing to debate in. One of those local TV stations had a network of local TV stations in Northern Ohio, and one in Wheeling, and they in Wheeling, West Virginia, and they had their own network televising it, but they didn't have a station in Cincinnati. And then the other one was only a Youngstown station that had no network, and it only aired there. But again, both were streamed through the web by those stations live.
I was going to ask you about that, because weirdly here in Oklahoma, that was the same for the gubernatorial debate. There zero television stations broadcast the debate. It was only an all live streamed, which was a first in Oklahoma history. So I didn't know that about Ohio. So I wonder if there's a trend even outside of the political nature of it, of that kind of, well, it's going to stream. And anyway, continue.
Yeah. Well, that is I mean, I think right, because in the past they would have been televised in every media market in Ohio. Yeah, but this time there was no local television station in Cincinnati that televised these debates, but they streamed from the local television stations in the different Ohio cities that were that aired them. So one was in Akron and one was in Youngstown. And the one in Akron, as I say, that owner actually owned half a dozen stations. So it aired on the stations in the cities that owner owned. I have to concede, although I'm definitely voting for Ryan, but I think Vance came off a little bit more better debater. Really, he is, I think, quicker on his feet. He's more agile and flexible. He's although of course, Ryan's been in Congress for 20 years, but I think Vance, who hasn't been around as long and hasn't been in Congress, he does do quite a lot of public speaking. He's always on book tours and things like that. And he seemed to me anticipate better some of the things that Ryan was going to say, and have quick comebacks that sounded fairly natural. I think Ryan once or twice that I observed kind of overplayed his cards a little bit. So Ryan very much wanted to pound on the meme that Vance had spent part of his career in San Francisco working as a venture capitalist and basically investing in companies that were moving jobs to China long before Vance reinvented himself as a guy who's against moving jobs to China. And this was the talking point that Ryan wanted to get back to again and again. But at some point, like I think Vance, who was ready for that, says, well, why don't you name one of those companies? What's one company that I ever invested in that moved jobs to China, and what jobs did it move to China? And Ryan didn't have that information at his fingertips, right?
It made him look like a fool. It made him look like an absolute fool.
Yeah. Yeah, if Ryan's going to make that allegation, which probably he could have, I believe it was a valid accusation, but he made it and he couldn't back it up, and that kind of thing, I think wasn't good. And similarly, I think he, Vance in other ways, I think was a little bit, I would say on the dishonest side, but sort of got away with it. Vance was, repudiating positions that he'd taken previously about both January 6th and about abortion, where Vance's positions on January 6th were that, it wasn't really an insurrection. And his position on abortion is that there shouldn't even be exceptions for rape or incest. And, he had said all those things before, but he not only, walked back from them, which, he's certainly allowed to do, but he denied ever saying all those things before, falsely. And I think that, Ryan at least was able to say, you're on tape saying this stuff, but it's still, I think Vance kind of skated out of the moment that way. And so it's hard for me to see that debate pushed any balls forward for Ryan. I think it's still a close race. Most of the polls have Vance ahead, but they mostly have it within the margin of error. So I think it is still a close race, but I don't know that there's too many undecided voters out there who watched that debate and then decided to vote for Ryan. There may be one or two who watched it and decided to vote for Vance, and that would kind of be my take on that. And I feel like that, that basic contour that, there wasn't much to change the minds of undecided voters in these debates, and particularly to change their minds in favor of voting for Democrats. That from the news coverage I read of the other debates, that seems to me to be the story in several of the battleground states.
One, I think another problem when we take a look at, say, Georgia and Herschel Walker, right? I think this demonstrates one of the problems that Democrats have, and that is they have a tendency now, I would say in the post-Daily Show era, the Democrats say, well, look, every Republican candidate is an idiot. And, Walker has been pegged as an idiot. Now, he may not be the sharpest knife in the drawer, but there's a difference between, that and being just an outright bumbling fool. And I think the problem is that you use that kind of language and you use that and that's the way you kind of set things up, both in funny ways and or in serious ways, in this case, both. And what you do is you effectively lower the expectations so that an average human being who can just easily step over those expectations, looks particularly brilliant. I will never figure out why Democrats think it's a great plan to just outright denigrate Republican candidates as being dummies, when obviously, clearly, although they might not agree with Democrats, or again, might not even be the sharpest knife in the drawer, isn't a complete outright idiot. It's a terrible, terrible strategy. Forget even what you think about it morally or another way. It's a terrible strategy. And I think Walker, in a similar way, looks really good. Like, so for example, Warnick says, look, there's not enough room, which is always a funny one for me coming from, I don't think it's a great setup for Democrats anyway, to say, well, there's not enough room for government. And I always think, well, is that really all your all's position all the time? But I'll set that aside for a second and just say, there's not enough room for government in the doctor's room, in the exam room between a doctor and a patient who's a woman. And Walker has this phenomenal comeback. He says, well, yeah, you're forgetting somebody. You're forgetting the baby in the room. There's 3 people in the room. And I think that was an example of where, Walker gets underestimated, and that makes the Democrats' job that much harder, right? It would have been that much easier to have a better debate against Walker had you not been hammering him as somebody who didn't know his own last name. So what do you think? I mean, I have often thought that that's just a terrible position, and I think that, going way back when, Democrats saw this like, oh, we'll just peg them all as being idiots, and this will win us elections. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that your critique is correct, that it's not politically beneficial to peg your opponent as an idiot, and wasn't politically beneficial for Democrats to try to do that to Walker. I don't know that applies to a lot of these other races, though. I don't think anybody ever said that the problem with J.D. Vance is that he's an idiot. I mean, he's a Yale Law
I was
School
using it for
graduate. He's a
Walker. That's
best-selling
true,
author.
since you were focusing there.
Yeah. So I don't know how widespread that is. I mean, I probably think almost everybody in Ohio, no matter who they're going to vote for in the Senate race, probably figures Vance has a higher IQ than Ryan. And there's not a lot of, I mean, I think that, and there's not, but I'm gonna vote for Ryan anyhow, right? I don't think the critique of Vance is that he's an idiot. Now Walker, I think it's tempting for Democrats to fall into that trap, because Walker is an idiot, and so it's kind of hard not to call him that. But I also agree with you that he's it's not a politically beneficial thing to do, even if it's true.
Now, here's another bit. So I've been looking at the polling data by state, because like we noted, it's not just the debates. And so here, as we start to move into a minute into predictions, it's worth thinking about. But when you look at these state by state breakdowns, just this past week, so yesterday, the weekly polling data from CBS News on, in this case, we're taking a look at Nevada, which is a really important state for Democrats. Things aren't looking good. Why might that be the case? Well, as you mentioned earlier, it's not just debates, right? That might not even be the biggest indicator. But when you take a look at what voters are talking about as being their most important issues, the top four in Nevada right now, the only things that crack over 60%, 84% the economy, 82% inflation, 69% crime, fascinating, 60% immigration. And if you dig into that, although they don't put that on their graphic, specifically what they're talking about is too much immigration. Then if you kind of dip under that to the next top issues that don't crack the 60 at 58 and 56, it's election issues. And heads up, that election issue means stronger election restrictions, and then gun policy at 56, looser gun policy. So although CBS wasn't, when you look at the questions and where people are answering, that's where it is. Man, I mean, that's a terrible slate of 6 issues for any Democrat running, even if you were to take out like the economy. So I mean, the other possibility here, and this is something you kind of look at, is to say, well, it's not always about how people are running. It's about which issues are particularly salient. So voters who are not already partisan ID'd, meaning they're going to vote on the basis of partisan ID, what generally makes them vote for one candidate over the other has very little potentially to do with being persuaded and a lot to do with being primed. That means saying, okay, well, here are my prime issues right now. Which candidate aligns with those particular issues? And so if you take a look at the priming framework in political science, in Nevada, in Georgia, and in Ohio right now, especially, again, right there, I'm giving the example from Nevada, that doesn't look particularly good for Democrats. So what do you think about on those issue fronts, on that priming front, Ken?
Yeah, well, the gun policy thing that you said, I actually wasn't sure why you thought that the people who care about gun issues are in favor of gun owner rights. I think there's a lot of people who are concerned about gun issues who want more gun control.
I just meant in that particular
sure
poll when you looked at their questions and the way they were asking it. I don't mean all the way across the board.
Yeah, because on that one, the question was just whether that's an issue you care about, right? It wasn't about which side of that issue you're on.
I'd have to pop that back up. I don't have that right in front of me, so I will run with it, Ken.
Yeah.
Run with it.
I would actually interpret if there's a statistic that shows a lot of people say they're concerned about gun issues, I would think the majority of them would be voting that would benefit the Democrats. That what they're saying is they want more regulation of guns, and so I think that's a good issue for the Democrats. The other ones, though, I agreed with your interpretations of what it probably meant. The latest two polls, I just looked on the Real Clear Politics where the page where they summarize all recent polls, and in Nevada, the two most recent polls are a CBS poll and a USA Today poll, and the CBS poll has the Republican Laxalt up by 1 point, and the USA Today poll. Yeah, tied, right. And I was going to say even more tied because the USA Today poll that's a few days older has the Democrat Cortez Mastro up by 2. So, you could look at that as both are very close. Both are within the margin of error. One falls on one side, one falls on the other side. If you want to look at the fact that there's a few days between them and that the more recent one is the one that favors the Republican, maybe that's not a great trend for the Democrats, but it's still, these are super close. There's the polling there shows Nevada now as a toss-up state. That itself is not good for the Dems because, a month or two ago, it would have been a leaning Dem state, and now it's not. And that's true in some other states as well. So it's, I don't like the direction that these recent trends are going. I certainly think that a number of states where the Dems had seemed safe enough that I didn't think that we'd have close races have turned into races that are too close to call. Here in Ohio, I guess it was always going to be a long shot for Ryan, and I think it's still going to be a long shot for Ryan. Vance has a lot of wind at his back, although I don't think it's completely out of reach for Ryan. And you've got close races now in Wisconsin, which I had very high hopes that Barnes was going to be able to win, and Pennsylvania's tightening, although I believe even the ailing Fetterman will hang on in Pennsylvania, but he was more than 10 points ahead for a long time. It wasn't even going to be a race, and that's not the story anymore over there. So yeah, things are moving, and I guess I see. To me, as I said earlier, I don't see the main driver of that being the debate. I do see the main driver of that being that as the campaign starts shaking her out around activating or motivating voters along the lines of particular issues they care about, just as you were talking about. I think the infusion of dark money at the last minute in favor of Republicans is really helping them focus those messages. So if they want to say to the voters, the issue is inflation or the issue is crime, and there are voters who respond to those messages, the Republicans right now have the means to really pound those messages with a massive amount of multi-pronged media campaigns, and they're reaching people and it's effective. So that's kind of my read on what's happening right now.
Let's continue to talk and kind of in this, it's another story sort of in a way, but it's an extension of this, which is our predictions for the midterms. And, on the one hand, I think one of the things to keep in mind when you're making these kinds of predictions is, and this was, when we had this conversation and you had made your bold claims, I had been a little bit more cautious because I said, don't forget the structural factors. And I think sometimes it's easy as we get closer to an election, as we see the structural factors play, and that is the party out of power with the president in office generally is facing major headwinds every single time. And so sometimes it's easy to miss the fact that that's always going to be the structural existence that you're in. And so as you see any particularistic election move in that direction, I don't think we should always be surprised. So while all these things we're talking about are important, as a political scientist, I can't help but say, but remember, the big predictor here is it's an non-presidential election where the party in power's president brings down the party. That's what happens every time. So as you move in that direction, I think, you shouldn't be surprised in some ways as a listener or, in kind of response, Ken, But additionally, we were talking about polls, and this is something I've been actually I have been tweeting. I don't do this often, but I've been tweeting out at, in this case, local Oklahoma pollsters as they've been talking about Hoffmeister and Stitt. And this one always bugs me, right? So as a stat, I do stats, right? And so they'll be like, well, and today, Stitt is up by 1 point, but now today, Joy is up by 2 points, but the margin of error is 3.5 percentage points. So I just want to get this out of my system for listeners. Remember that if you have a difference that is smaller than the margin of error, what you have is a tie. right? You don't know anything. You cannot say anything. You can't say, well, it's a 1% difference. No, because until you get a unit bigger than the margin of error, you actually can't yet say anything about it. So, I mean, you're saying something, but you're just saying it's tied. So anything inside of that is a tie. So for everybody in Oklahoma who keeps thinking that we've had, lead changes every week for the last 4 weeks, and I'm looking at you, all my local media friends, you're wrong. Instead, we've had consistency. We've had ties for 4 weeks. Don't get locked into that horse race narrative that you'll oftentimes see from local media who wouldn't know how to add 2 plus 2 if it came to statistics. So I just wanted to start there. So anyway, but now moving forward to that, Ken, kind of give us a base level for talking about predictions, right? If you take a look at 538, they are forecasting a 79 and 100% or a 79 and 100 chance for Republicans to take control of the House, and a 21 and 100 for Dems. Meanwhile, in the Senate, it's a whole heck of a lot closer, 59 and 100 for Dems, 41 and 100 for Republicans. Now, if Republicans, of course, claim either chamber, this is going to be kind of the end of the road for the Biden administration for doing things, and it's going to either have to negotiate, which is probably unlikely under the current circumstances, unlike with Clinton, or what I think is more likely and deeply unfortunate, which is resort to additional unilateral actions so that they can continue to claim that they're doing things. But so what do you think about those chances? I tend to think that 538 is actually, based on their methodology, underestimating Republicans' likelihood for taking the Senate by a little bit, but that still puts it close one way or the other. So what are your predictions now for November more explicitly?
You mean on the election, or on what would happen if the Republicans got one of the houses?
No. So on the election itself. So what, who wins House, who wins Senate?
Yeah. I was very confident before that the Dems would keep the Senate. I'm glad that 538 thinks they're most likely still to keep the Senate, even as their leads are weakening. I think that still happens because I think, to me, you have to look at the individual races, and I do think Pennsylvania, it's extremely unfortunate that Fetterman had this stroke and it's been costing him. But there's never been any polls ever where he wasn't out ahead. His lead isn't as big as it was. But I think the Dems have a pickup in Pennsylvania, and that gives them one state to lose, even to keep their current 50-50 majority. Yeah, which is a majority if you've got the vice presidency. So they could lose one and still keep that. And I think there are a few they're at risk of losing, but I think in every one of those close races, there's a chance that the Dem incumbent will lose, but probably the Dem incumbent will hang on. And even if they lose one of them, they still have the majority. So I don't really see them losing two. It's possible they could lose their current seat in Nevada. It's possible they could lose their current seat in Georgia. But I think, I don't think they'll lose both. And so I do think the Dems keep the Senate. The House has always been tougher. And, we've both always said that there has been a fresh round of gerrymandering. The Dems would have to actually win the popular vote by almost 4% to keep their majority. There's a lot of scenarios where, and I'm actually confident that the Dems will get more votes, that more Americans will cast a vote for Democratic candidates in the House of Representatives than for Republican candidates in the House of Representatives. But that alone isn't going to be enough to keep the majority. It's going to have to be, that the votes are cast in the right places and that they add up to almost 4% margin of victory. And I don't know, so I think I would probably go with the 538 prediction and say that the Dems wind up with 50 or 51 in the Senate, and the Dems probably don't keep the House, although I think it'll be very close.
Okay, so now, Ken, I'm going to do, we're kind of actually running long for a Politics Guys episode.
Yeah.
So here's what I'm going to do, because I want to get everything in that I mentioned. We're going to do a 2-in-1 kind of lightning round Supreme Court or court things, right? So we're going to do kind of two cases here, and then we're going to finish up the show. One is on Thursday, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals denied Lindsey Graham a claim of immunity to block a subpoena from the Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis, arguing, as he was, that a sitting senator should be shielded from such investigations. The court wrote, quote, Senator Graham has failed to demonstrate that this approach will violate his rights under the speech and debate clauses. The order goes on to say, referring to the constitutional provision that protects lawmakers from being questioned about their legislative activity, something we're going to be talking about in bonus shows. As a matter of fact, the last month, the district court had ruled oppositely, arguing that they could not question some portions of it, but other parts were open to it. So it depended on if he was having legislative fact-finding or not. Thus, according to the 6-page order, quote, we thus find it unlikely that questions about them would violate the speech and debate clause, end quote. So we've got that from the 11th Circuit. Meanwhile, Amy Barrett denied also on Thursday the expedited emergency plea to block the Biden administration loan debt cancellation program. The application had been filed by Wisconsin taxpayers groups on Wednesday, and although this is not a case on the merit, argued that that there was no grounds for the emergency order. Okay, so Ken, lightning round, your thoughts on these two? One decision / one procedural motion decision.
Yeah. Do you want me to just do one at a time so you can respond, or you want me to just go right through both of them?
Go right through both of them. You're the expert on this.
Okay. Yeah. So first, the thing with Lindsey Graham. So the speech or debate clause of Article 1, Section 6 of the U.S. Constitution says that members of Congress cannot be questioned in any other place in connection with any speech or debate that they've made in the Congress. Now, clearly, Lindsey Graham didn't make any speech or debate in the Congress that he's being questioned about. He's being questioned about a phone call that he made to the Georgia Secretary of State. But the Supreme Court has expanded the meaning of the word speech or debate beyond just literal speeches and literal debates. It includes all legislative acts that are committed within a scope of a legislator's employment as a legislator. So things like drafting bills or voting on bills or conducting committee hearings or things like that are included in the immunity that legislators have. So the idea that they can't be questioned in any other place means essentially that they can't be held liable civilly or criminally, and they can't be subpoenaed, which is what Graham is arguing. Now, that does only apply to legislative acts committed within the scope of their legislative duties. So Graham had been trying to argue that when he called the Secretary of State of Georgia to try to get him to throw out votes, that really what Graham was doing was he was making that call so that he could investigate issues that Congress might then need to legislate about. So he claimed that this was connected to a legislative act. That would have been an expansion of the doctrine, although congressional committee investigations probably are covered by speech or debate clause immunity. The idea that any legislator's communications with anyone could be covered by the speech or debate clause immunity simply if the legislator says those magic words, well, I made this communication because I was trying to decide whether I wanted to introduce a bill. That would really extend it to an absolute immunity. And no court has ever done that. There are many cases, including in the U.S. Supreme Court, where legislators are able to be held liable for things that they did or said. Including cases involving legislators taking bribes or legislators defaming people during their campaign events and things like that. There's a lot of cases like that where the court has said those things are not actually part of your legislative duties. You don't get the speech or debate clause immunity. And I think the 11th Circuit holding correctly found that there's just nothing about Graham's call to the Georgia Secretary of State, which he had hoped to keep secret, which would in any way be part of his work as a senator. So was that a brief and concise?
No, that was beautiful. Yeah. Okay, so what are your thoughts on Amy Barrett's decision?
Yeah. So this was another one where the Supreme Court has erected a lot of doctrines that are called justiciability doctrines, which are ways of saying that the court lacks jurisdiction to hear certain kinds of cases. even if those cases would be meritorious under the law. And one of the big justiciability doctrines that the court has had for about 50 years, although this doctrine did not exist until the 1960s. It's not an ancient doctrine or anything. But beginning in the 1960s, the court started interpreting a clause of the Constitution. There's a clause in Article 3, Section 2 that talks about what the jurisdiction of the federal courts is. And it lists 9 categories of cases or controversies. There's 9 types of cases or controversies that courts can hear. Cases brought under federal law, or cases brought between citizens of 2 different states, or cases in admiralty, which means cases at sea. And I'm not going to go through the whole list, but there's 9. And what the court started saying in the 1960s is, well, even if a plaintiff files a lawsuit against a defendant, and it looks like it's a case or controversy, there's a case filed, and it looks like it's a federal question case because there's an issue of federal law cited in the complaint. And so it looks like it might fit within that case or controversy requirement and be something that the courts would have jurisdiction over. The doctrine of standing says it's not a real case or controversy unless the plaintiff has actually personally suffered a particularized injury in fact. So there has to be a real injury that's been suffered by the plaintiff, and it also has to be an injury that hasn't been suffered by everyone else in the country. And so that became the issue in this case. You've got some individual in Indiana who files a lawsuit and says, I don't think President Biden had legal authority to forgive all the student debts, and that's going to have to be paid for out of the general revenues, and I'm a taxpayer, so I'm injured by that. Now, the court's standing doctrine, again, going back about 50 years, has been fairly clear on the idea that the fact that someone is a taxpayer and that they think that the government is going to misspend their money is not a particularized injury in fact. Even if it might be an injury, it's not a particularized injury in fact because it's shared by every other taxpayer. So the court has had a pretty high bar against taxpayer standing, and it used to have a few exceptions to that bar. But in recent years, really very recent years, really, it's even eliminated the last of those exceptions. So under the court's current doctrine, taxpayers simply don't have standing to bring cases. Now, in the Indiana case, the plaintiff said, I know that there's a rule against taxpayer standing, and I know that that rule bars me from bringing this case, but I'm bringing this case anyhow because I'm actually asking the court to reconsider that rule and to relax its rule against taxpayer standing. So here, Justice Barrett, just simply because she's from Indiana and she's the circuit justice for the 7th Circuit, which includes Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, she has to make the decision whether to simply deny and dismiss this petition or whether to forward it to the whole court and let the court decide if it wants to make a change in the law of standing. And she did decide, well, here we have a petitioner who even the petitioner himself agrees he doesn't have standing under current law, that this case has to be dismissed unless we apply current law, unless we change the current law. And she says, you know what, I don't think we need to change the current law right now, so I'm dismissing the petition. So that's essentially what happened. One interesting thing about that approach is that it's very likely that if the court sticks to that approach and doesn't make any changes in standing law, that no one will ever be able to challenge President Biden's debt forgiveness order, because it seems hard to see how anyone is going to be injured by that. There were a few claims that I think did not pan out. Somebody was claiming that because his state will tax the debt forgiveness, that he'll be injured by having to pay state income taxes on the debt forgiveness. But the government responded that anyone's allowed to opt out of the debt forgiveness, so nobody's injured that way. It's just they can just opt out, and the courts have accepted that argument. And there was some thought that some of the financial institutions that get paid commissions to administer student loans might be injured because, say, they're paid a dime to process every monthly payment, and now with all this debt forgiveness, there's not going to be as many monthly payments. That they might be injured by that. But I think the education department is actually paying them those dimes anyhow, so they're not injured by that. So we could wind up moving towards a situation where there's nobody can challenge this. And there's other constitutional provisions where that has been the case. For instance, there's a requirement in the Constitution that the budget be published every time Congress passes a budget. And for many years, They've kept big black parts of the intelligence budget unpublished. And there have been a number of lawsuits against that. And I think it's plainly an unconstitutional decision to not publish parts of the budget when there's a clear requirement in the Constitution that the budget has to be published. But the court has continuously found that nobody has standing to bring that claim, and therefore the court cannot adjudicate that claim. So this might be something that falls into that bucket.
Well, the only thing I'll add is just a minor clarification. The application was actually filed in Wisconsin, taxpayers, not Indiana.
Oh, in Wisconsin. I'm sorry.
Not a big deal. But I was just going to help out there. Well, thank you for the lightning round, Ken. You got through those quick. I appreciate it, because that's all we've got for this week's show. If you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Without you, we can't keep the podcast going. And the cool thing is, when you become a supporter, you get all kind of cool stuff, like ad-free versions of this show, as well as our supporter-exclusive midweek show, where we break away from the constraints of the news cycle and discuss things. In our case, Ken and I are tackling the Constitution by popular request. And so this upcoming bonus show, we're going to be talking about the preamble in Article 1. Next week, we're going to get deeper into Article 1. We just got through sections 1, 2, and 3 for the upcoming. We're going to go for that. It's a ton of fun. I'm really excited about this, and I hope you'll join us as we explore the U.S. Constitution. But to do that, you've got to become a supporter. Supporters can also join our very active Politics Guys Discord group. And there's even Politics Guys gear and other kinds of cool benefits at different levels. If you want to check it all out, just head to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you'd like to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. All of our support links, they're easy to click right there in the show notes, or as well at politicsguys.com/support. If you'd like to get our midweek show, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, we get that. I get that. I got 3 kiddos. Just email mike@politicsguys.com and we can get you set up. Whether you're a supporter or not, don't forget that you can subscribe, rate, and review on whatever podcast app you use. We'd love to be number 1 in politics, and that's the only way it's going to happen. So please click those buttons. If you've got a question, comment, correction, gripe, manifesto, or anything else you'd like to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. You'll find all of this fun stuff right there in the show notes. The wonderful executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Morono, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week. I hope you'll join us then. Ken,